He said it in a low voice, not angry, not loud, but heavy enough to stop the air in the room. I will not share you. In that moment, love stopped feeling safe. It felt like a cage slowly closing, and everyone standing inside it knew something had just changed forever. The room was quiet, but the silence carried weight. It was the kind of silence that made every breath sound loud, every thought dangerous. She stood there, not moving, not speaking, trying to understand when love turned into control. This was not how it started. At the beginning, everything felt warm, protective, even beautiful. He was strong, confident, the kind of man who made promises sound like safety. But power has a way of changing its shape when fear steps in. Slowly, his affection became possession, and his care became a watchful eye that never looked away. She could feel it in the way he spoke her name, in the way his eyes followed her every move. The world around them was built on deals, loyalty, and silence, and in that world, love was never simple. Everyone knew his name. Everyone feared crossing him. And now she was standing in the center of that fear, realizing that loving him meant standing on a line that could collapse at any moment. The air felt heavy, not with anger, but with something worse certainty. He believed he owned what he loved. And for the first time, she realized how dangerous that belief could be. The past did not arrive loudly. It crept in through memory. She remembered the early days when his touch felt protective, when his words felt like promises instead of warnings. Back then, his world looked powerful, exciting, untouchable. She thought standing beside him meant safety. She did not know it also meant surrender. Slowly, choices were no longer hers alone. Who she spoke to, where she went, what she shared, everything began to pass through him first. Not because he asked, but because he expected it. And expectations can be heavier than commands. Around them, people whispered, watched, and waited. In their world, love was courtesy, and loyalty was survival. He had built an empire on control, and control does not like to be questioned. When she tried to push back, even gently, the air shifted. His calm voice carried an edge, reminding her of what he could take away. It was not cruelty, but certainty. That was what scared her the most. She realized then that love was no longer about closeness. It had become a boundary she was not allowed to cross without permission. The words came out quietly, but they carried the weight of a threat. I will not share you, not shouted, not begged, declared. In that moment, everything changed. The room felt smaller, the walls closer, the future narrower. She looked at him and saw not just the man she loved, but the world he ruled. A world where loyalty was demanded, not earned. Where love came with conditions written in silence. She wanted to speak, to argue, to remind him that love could not survive inside a cage. But fear has a way of stealing words. She knew what defiance could cost. Around them, power moved like a shadow, unseen but always present. He believed he was protecting what was his. She realized she was being claimed. The line had been crossed, and there was no way back to who they were before. This was no longer about romance. It was about control, ownership, and the dangerous belief that love could justify anything. As the moment stretched, she understood the truth that had been hiding in plain sight. Love should make you feel seen, not trapped. Safe, not watched. Free, not owned. Yet here she was, standing at the edge of a life chosen for her. The silence between them was louder than any argument. In that silence, she saw her future split into paths, one where she stayed and slowly disappeared, and another where she walked away and risked everything. He believed his power could keep her close forever. But power built on fear always cracks. The question was not whether he would lose control, but when. And when that moment came, everything they had built would fall with it. As the tension hung in the air, one truth became clear: this was no longer a love story. It was the beginning of a war between possession and freedom. And only one of them would survive it and change. The moment she realized how deeply trapped she was did not come with shouting or anger. It came quietly, in the way his eyes followed her across the room, In the way every conversation stopped when she entered, in the way people looked at her as if she already belonged to him. At first, she told herself it was love. Strong love. The kind people fear because it has weight. But slowly, that weight began to press against her chest. Every choice she made felt watched, measured, judged. Even silence felt loud around him. He never raised his voice, never demanded directly. He didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to remind her that nothing in his world moved without his approval. She remembered the first time she noticed the change. A simple moment, almost forgettable. She had laughed too freely with someone else, and his smile faded for just a second. That was all it took. Later that night, his tone was calm, controlled, but colder than before. He spoke about loyalty, about respect, about knowing where one belongs. She nodded, even though something inside her tightened. That was the beginning of her understanding. Love, in his world, came with invisible rules. Rules you learned by breaking them once. As time passed, the walls grew closer. She found herself choosing silence over honesty, peace over truth. Not because she wanted to lie, but because truth came with consequences. He never needed to raise his hand or his voice. His power lived in his certainty. He believed he had earned the right to decide, to protect, to claim. And in his mind, protection and control were the same thing. The more powerful he became, the smaller her world felt. Friends disappeared. Freedom faded. Even her thoughts felt watched. She tried to remind herself of who she was before him. The woman who spoke freely, who moved without fear, who dreamed without permission. But that version of her felt distant now, like a memory belonging to someone else. Every time she tried to reach for it, doubt pulled her back. What would happen if she pushed too hard? What would he take away next? Love should not feel like survival. Yet here she was measuring every word, every breath, as if one wrong step could change everything. And still, part of her held on to hope. Hope that he would see her, truly see her. Hope that the man who once looked at her with warmth could return. But deep down, she knew the truth she was afraid to face. This was not a moment of misunderstanding. This was a pattern. And patterns, once set, rarely break without damage. The power he held over her was no longer just emotional, it was absolute. And as the silence between them grew heavier, one thought echoed louder than all the rest. If she stayed, she would disappear. The tension between them did not explode all at once. It grew slowly, like a storm forming far beyond the horizon, quiet but impossible to stop. Every look he gave her now carried meaning. Every pause in his voice felt deliberate. He no longer needed to say what he wanted. She could feel it in the air, heavy and unspoken. The house that once felt like shelter now felt like a boundary she was not allowed to cross. Even the walls seemed to listen. She began to realize that control does not always come with force. Sometimes it arrives disguised as care, wrapped in calm words and steady hands. He spoke often about loyalty. Not in anger, not in warning, but as if it were a law of nature, something unchangeable. He spoke about how people betray each other when they forget where they belong. Every sentence sounded like advice, but every word carried a message meant only for her. She noticed how he watched her reactions, studying her face, measuring how much of his power she had accepted. In his world, love was proven through obedience, and devotion was measured by silence. The more she listened, the more she understood that he did not fear losing her love. He feared losing control. There were moments when she wanted to speak, to tell him that love should not feel like a cage. But fear wrapped around her thoughts. Not fear of violence, but fear of consequence. She knew what happened to those who disappointed him. They were not shouted at or punished loudly. They were erased, pushed aside, forgotten. Their absence became a warning to everyone else. She had seen it happen before, and now she understood why no one ever challenged him. Silence was survival. Inside her, something began to crack. She remembered who she was before this world claimed her. A woman who trusted her instincts, who spoke without checking the room first, That version of herself felt distant now, like a shadow fading at sunset. She wondered if love was supposed to make you smaller, or if that was the price of staying close to power. Each time she tried to reclaim a piece of herself, doubt followed. Was she being ungrateful, disloyal, weak, or was she finally seeing the truth? The truth was dangerous. It meant admitting that what she felt was not love, but control wrapped in affection. It meant accepting that staying would cost her more than leaving ever could. Yet leaving felt impossible. His world had become her world, his rules her reality. Every door seemed locked from the outside. Still, something inside her refused to disappear completely. A quiet strength remained, buried deep beneath fear and obligation. It whispered that control only survives as long as it is accepted. As she stood there, caught between fear and freedom, she realized the most dangerous moment had already passed. It was the moment she stopped believing his version of love. From that point on, everything would change. The question was no longer whether she would break free, but what I. The silence between them had changed. It no longer felt heavy with fear, but sharp with awareness. She could feel it in the way her thoughts moved faster now, no longer trapped in circles. Something inside her had shifted, quietly but completely. The power he once held over her was starting to weaken, not because he had changed, but because she had. She no longer saw him as untouchable. She saw him as a man clinging to control because without it, he had nothing. He sensed it too. Control is fragile when questioned, and he felt it slipping. His voice became firmer, his presence more deliberate, his eyes searching her face for the obedience he was used to seeing. But she no longer lowered her gaze. She met his stare, calm and steady, and that unsettled him more than anger ever could. For the first time, he realized that fear was no longer enough to hold her. The silence between them turned dangerous, not because of what was said, but because of what was no longer working. She began to notice how often he spoke about loyalty, about sacrifice, about us as if it were a rule rather than a bond. Every sentence sounded rehearsed, like something he had told himself for years. In his world, love was ownership, and ownership meant safety. He believed he was protecting her, shaping her, keeping her from harm. But what he could not see was that he had become the very thing she needed protection from. His love had built walls so high that even light struggled to get through. The more he tightened his grip, the more aware she became of her own strength. It had been there all along, buried under fear and doubt. She realized she had been surviving instead of living, choosing silence over truth because it felt safer. But safety without freedom was just another kind of prison. She began to understand that leaving would not be an act of betrayal, but an act of survival. The idea frightened her, yet it also brought a strange sense of peace. Every step she took away from his control felt like walking on unstable ground. The future was unclear, filled with risk and uncertainty. But for the first time, the fear she felt did not belong to him. It belonged to her, and that made all the difference. She was no longer reacting to his power. She was reclaiming her own. Even in the quiet moments, when doubt tried to pull her back, she held onto the truth she had discovered. Love should never require the loss of self. In that realization, something inside her settled. She no longer needed his permission to exist, to choose, to breathe. The hold he once had over her began to fade, not because he released it, but because she refused to carry it any longer. What lay ahead was uncertain, and the cost of freedom would not be small. But for the first time, she understood that staying would cost her everything. And that knowledge changed her forever. The moment she finally stepped away did not feel dramatic. There was no sudden escape, no loud argument, no doors slamming behind her. It happened quietly, almost gently, the way endings often do when they have been coming for a long time. She simply stopped waiting for his permission. That was the moment everything changed. The fear that once kept her still lost its grip, replaced by a calm she had not felt in years. It was not courage yet, but it was close enough to carry her forward. She moved through the world differently now. Her steps were slower, more certain. She noticed things she had ignored before: the sound of her own breath, the weight of her own thoughts, the space she was finally allowed to occupy. Every small decision felt like a rebellion. Choosing where to go, choosing when to speak, choosing silence not out of fear, but out of strength. The power he once held over her began to feel distant, like a memory that no longer had teeth. He noticed the change immediately. The way she no longer looked to him for approval. The way her eyes no longer searched his face before she spoke. It unsettled him more than anger ever could. Control had always been his language, and now she was speaking one he did not understand. He tried to pull her back with familiar words, with reminders of everything he had given her, everything she would lose without him. But those words no longer carried weight. They sounded hollow, rehearsed, empty. For the first time, she saw him clearly, not as the powerful figure everyone feared, but as someone terrified of being alone. His strength had always come from the belief that he was needed, and now that belief was slipping through his fingers. She did not hate him. She did not want revenge. What she wanted was distance. Space to remember who she was before her life revolved around his shadow. Walking away was not easy. Every step felt like stepping into the unknown. There were moments when doubt tried to pull her back, whispering that life had been easier when decisions were made for her. But ease was not freedom. Comfort was not peace. She reminded herself of every moment she had swallowed her voice, every time she had stayed silent to keep the balance. Those memories became her strength. As she moved forward, something inside her began to heal. Slowly, quietly, without ceremony. She started to imagine a future that belonged to her alone. A future where her worth was not measured by loyalty or obedience. A future where love did not demand sacrifice of self. She did not know what waited ahead, but she knew one thing with certainty. She would never return to a life where her existence depended on someone else's control. In the end, the greatest victory was not escaping him. It was finding herself again. And as she stepped into the unknown, she understood that freedom was not something given. It was something claimed. Time passed in a way she had never experienced before. Not rushed, not heavy, but open. Each day felt like a quiet discovery, as if she were learning how to exist again without asking permission. There were moments when the past tried to pull her back: memories, doubts, familiar fears, but they no longer had the same power. She had crossed a line that could not be undone. The person she used to be, the one who lived inside someone else's shadow, was gone. In her place stood someone still uncertain, still healing, but finally her own. The world looked different when she stopped viewing it through fear. Sounds felt sharper. Colors seemed brighter. Even silence felt different, no longer threatening, but peaceful. She began to understand how much of herself she had buried just to survive. Simple things became meaningful again: choosing where to go, how long to stay, what she wanted without needing approval. These choices, small as they were, stitched her back together piece by piece. Each decision reminded her that freedom was not a single moment, but a series of quiet acts of courage. She sometimes thought about him, but without anger. Not with longing either. More like understanding. She could see now that he had never truly known how to love without control. His fear of losing power had shaped everything he touched, but that fear no longer belonged to her. She had carried it long enough. What remained was a sense of release, soft, steady, and real. For the first time, her life felt like something she was allowed to shape with her own hands. There were nights when doubt crept in, whispering questions about whether she had done the right thing. Those moments still came, especially when the world felt uncertain. But even then, she no longer felt trapped. She had learned that fear does not disappear all at once. It fades as confidence grows. Each step forward made the next one easier. Each choice reinforced the truth that she was capable of standing alone. As time passed, she began to trust herself again. Not the version shaped by fear, but the one that existed before everything became complicated. She discovered strength in her voice, comfort in her solitude, and peace in her independence. The life ahead of her was not perfect, but it was honest. It belonged to her, and in that quiet certainty, she found something more powerful than love or control. She found freedom.